G'day, ZiggyD here, and welcome to the build guide for my crit Glacial Cascade character that I've been playing in Ambush. This is a softcore oriented build. It could probably be adapted for hardcore if you were to spec a bit more for life and use things like the Cloak of Defiance and Sephiroth's Frame, but I think this is most fun played in a softcore league as a bit of a glass cannon, absolutely destroying and shattering things. She is a bit squishy. I have around 3k life. I think you could probably get to something like 3.5, a bit over that k life, with a bit more investment into gear and with a few more levels and passive points spent on life. But that said, despite the squishy actual stats and also not having much armor in my current setup, it is actually reasonably survivable thanks to some pretty powerful defensive mechanics. Firstly, Glacial Cascade being the main skill, actually freezes really effectively in a crit build. It is a bit of a small AoE sort of freeze, so it's not always super reliable. So, to counteract that, I also use Cold Snap to freeze packs before I engage with them. And I use Cold Snap linked to Proliferate and Cold Penetration, and it's actually really powerful, especially if I do get that crit, because I have decent high crit chance, and crit multi, especially once I've got my power charges up. It's pretty easy to get that crit, and if you say crit like some trash mobs with the Cold Snap, then everything around them will be Proliferate frozen. So that means any rares, even bosses, can be frozen next to a bunch of trap mobs for 5-10 seconds sometimes. Well enough time to actually kill those mobs before they even engage with you. So that's very powerful, and basically fighting stuff that can't move is a pretty strong defensive tactic. And on top of that, we have Castman Damage Taken, which it's got the standard Enduring Cry Molten Shell setup, which is just kind of meh, just what it is. But the one that I really like for this character is I also have Frost Wall on Castman Damage Taken. You'll see this go off whenever I take a bit of damage, so whenever something unfreezes and sneaks a few hits in, whether they be ranged attacks or melee attacks, Frost Wall will proc, it'll cast on top of them, pushing them away from me, sometimes pushing them a long way away from me if they sort of get caught on the tail end of the Frost Wall. As it spreads out, it actually knocks them all the way like to the edge of the screen. And this is pretty fun because it separates them from me, it prevents projectiles from hitting me, but Glacial Cascade can go through Frost Wall. So I really like this setup on this character. Having Glacial Cascade, still being able to attack enemies while they can't attack you, reminds me of the old Ground Slam Marauder Frost Wall days. But you don't have to manually cast it, it happens automatically, so fantastic stuff. And the combination of all of these different things, on top of running Arctic Armor as well, as an Eldritch Battery character, I'm able to run a high level Arctic Armor. The character actually does a pretty good job of staying alive despite being pretty squishy. The only things that I find are a bit weak are heavy hitting fizz melee mobs that I have to get melee with, or are very hard to avoid getting the melee with. So things like Flicker Strike Spiders or Bubble mobs can be the only things that really give me some troubles. But other than that, everything else gets frozen or knocked away with Frost Wall, and then destroyed pretty quickly with the very high damage from Glacial Cascade. So other than that, I use crit weakness as my curse for obvious reasons. I use a decoy totem sometimes to distract things if they are a bit of a pain, for example like a Flicker Strike Spider. And I use Lightning Warp to get up over and around things, or if my Frost Wall, if I want to get on the other side of my Frost Wall and don't want to wait for it to finish, I can use Lightning Warp. But the main focus of this build is indeed Glacial Cascade. Now I use this both for leveling and at endgame with this character, and it's actually a very powerful leveling skill. I think a lot of people have sort of realized this now. It does really good damage, better damage than Freeze Pulse with LMP for most of the leveling process. It's a smaller AoE, but it's still pretty solid really compared to LMP Freeze Pulse. It's pretty reasonable. The only thing that's a lot better in terms of AoE at endgame is GMP Freeze Pulse with faster projectiles and things like that. The AoE is not as big, and because this is an AoE skill, I do use increased area of effect to help counteract that, along with the Divinarius unique that has 10% AoE and stuff like that. But we'll go over the gear a little bit later in the video. But what makes Glacial Cascade really good damage at endgame, and you should be seeing from the videos that it actually does really effective damage, is that it has an interesting mechanic where it'll hit each monster at least twice, sometimes 3 times if they're a larger mob. Or if you have less AoE, or if you are using knockback or something like that. But for the purposes of my build, I'm hitting every mob twice. Now with a crit build, and I do think you should build Glacial Cascade characters as crit builds, I don't think this skill would be very effective in a non-crit build, but because of the way it works and hits twice, crit is absolutely fantastic. Now I use added lightning, and the damage from adding lightning damage means that when I crit, the first hit will shock stack them, giving them a 30% damage debuff, so they take 30% more damage. And then the second hit will happen instantly after that first hit, and that will be another crit, because every hit in one cast of Glacial Cascade is a guaranteed crit if that whole thing is rolled as a crit, essentially. So what that means is you crit and shock stack them, then the second hit hits, the second hit deals 30% more damage, and will crit and shock stack them again. And you end up dealing huge amounts of damage. And then if you follow up with another Glacial Cascade, well, let's just say if you haven't killed them in the first cast of Glacial Cascade, you usually kill them in the second one, as long as it crits. You'll notice when I'm not critting, I'm not dealing too much damage, but when it crits, it deals absolutely insane amounts of damage because of that shock stacking there. The actual tooltip DPS is somewhere around 4k per hit, and it hits twice. But it actually calculates to be a lot more than that when you factor in the crit multi and shock stacking and things like that. Alrighty, so to start off with, we have Glacial Cascade. Now I linked this with Power Charge on crit. If you can get a quality Power Charge on crit, it's nice. It will mean that you generate them a bit more reliably. It's very easy to maintain power charges once you get your full 7 power charges. It's very easy to maintain them, and that's the reason I do use Power Charge on crit on Glacial Cascade. I did play around a lot with using something like Ice Spear with LMP and Power Charge on crit, but I don't like having to take time away from attacking with your main skill to be able to generate power charges. It felt really bad, and I felt like overall I was losing effective DPS time. So I had decided to sacrifice the support gem slot and just run power charge on crit, and it actually makes the build a lot more fun to play, and makes it's very effective. You generate your power charges very effectively. Now, because Glacial Cascade hits multiple times on each mob, and because it can hit a lot of mobs within its AoE, like it's a pretty solid AoE now with all my AoE increases, although you can only generate 1 power charge per cast, there's a higher chance of you generating that power charge because it rolls a 50% chance to gain a power charge for each crit. And let's say there's 2 mobs here, I'll hit each one of those twice. So if I get a crit, so if this rolls as a crit, then it'll crit this one twice, it'll crit this one twice. That's 4 chances to get a power charge. So every time you crit, you pretty much get a power charge on this. It's very rarely that you won't, unless you're attacking a single mob. So I really like using power charge on crit on Glacial Cascade. It feels a lot more effective than Ice Spear. Next up, I use increased area of effect. You can use Conk Effect, but I really like having the increased AoE on this skill. The AoE is kind of difficult to use on Glacial Cascade. It's one of the only bad things about this spell, is that it is a bit trickier to use. It's kind of like a narrower version of EK, or a longer but thinner version of Freeze Pulse. So although the range is really good now, I can practically off-screen with it, it still is a bit of a narrow corridor, like it's about the width of this rug just here. So increased AoE I think is pretty necessary. Next up, I use Cold Penetration. For a very long time until I switched to Eldritch Battery, I did use Mana Leech. Glacial Cascade is incredibly expensive, as you can see, 114 mana cost there, and if I go to a 6-link, it'll probably go up to like 160 or something ridiculous like that. So Mana Leech is very handy, but once you can drop Mana Leech, once you have enough mana with Eldritch Battery to sustain it, you can switch over to Cold Penetration, which increases your damage dramatically. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Added Lightning is fantastic. If you can get a quality Added Lightning, it's certainly not going to hurt, but mostly you're critting a lot of the time anyway, and shock stacking is the whole reason you use Added Lightning. Sure, it's nice to have a bit of extra elemental damage and it doesn't hurt, and a lot of people recommend using Added Chaos. Added Chaos, you'll notice, actually gives more tooltip DPS, so you can see 2,500 should go up 2,700, so more tooltip with Added Chaos, but Added Chaos doesn't have that secondary effect of increasing all of your other hits by 30% per shock stack. So the shock stacking, I've tested this pretty thoroughly now, and the shock stacking is a huge boon to the damage of the skill. And overall, I'm very happy with how Glacial Cascade works. The current meta of PoE is that fire spells really look much more powerful than everything else, and a lot of the time you're playing any other type of build, you're thinking, I probably could have just cleared this full screen with 1 cast of Flame Blast, and unfortunately that is the case. But in terms of ignoring the really OP stuff at the moment, Glacial Cascade feels like a very effective, viable skill, and it's very fun to play. So I kind of ignore those things that are super OP, like Detonate Dead and Flame Blast and Searing Bond and stuff like that, and just be like, how does this skill actually feel, just looking at itself, and maybe comparing it to other ice spells, and I'm very happy with how it works. So, other skills I use, as I said, I use Cold Snap, I usually initiate with this, so if there's a larger pack or something a bit dangerous, say like a bunch of Chaos projectile shooting mobs, I'll simply throw out a Cold Snap, and that first cast is basically free, doesn't cost any power charges, but if it doesn't freeze, I can follow up with a second one, which will expend one of my power charges, so you can bypass the cooldown, and you should have like 7 charges almost all the time, and you can get that freeze off if that first one didn't freeze, so it's really nice, and as I said, it does a really effective job at freezing. Now, I only have a level 14 Cold Snap, and I still freeze things for like 5 to 10 seconds sometimes when I crit. So you can imagine at level 18 to level 20, once I actually level Cold Snap up some more, because I only started using this recently, it will get very, very effective at freezing mobs, so I'm very happy with how that works. And Elemental Proliferation is mandatory for that, and Cold Penetration is very helpful as well. That's not necessary, but Elemental Proliferation is mandatory, but Cold Penetration certainly doesn't hurt. Next up, I use Vaal Ice Nova. This is something I haven't mentioned just yet, and I'll cut to some footage of Vaal Ice Nova and exactly how it works. I basically call this my Get Wrecked button, because when you activate this thing, it takes a little while to charge up, but when you activate it, absolutely just clears out the entire screen. The way Vaal Ice Nova works is it uses a Ice Nova, pretty standard, but then each Ice Nova that hits an enemy will cast another Ice Nova up to 5 times. It chains up to 5 times. So when you have a very big pack of monsters, it gets more and more exponentially powerful, and you'll deal a ton of damage, enough to, especially if it crits, you'll deal enough to fully clear out the screen. Now, I use this to clear out lockboxes, and it does very well versus those. I have it linked to a mine, so I put the mine down, I open the lockbox, I wait until the mobs appear, and then I detonate the mine. And then, secondly, I use Increased Area of Effect to help it proc. Increased Area of Effect is actually very good on this skill. It helps with making sure that it does bounce to each additional mob, and it can actually make it chain off screen a lot of the time as well, spreading throughout the map. Now, that could be really bad if you killed yourself to reflect, but thankfully, because we're using a mine, reflect is a non-issue for the huge damage that Vaal Ice Nova puts out. So you can safely and without fear use your Get Wrecked button, and you'll never die to reflect. In fact, I actually use this to clear out reflect packs. So I'll usually keep a charge with me. If I get a lockbox, I'll use it on that. Or if there's a big reflect pack, what I'll use Vaal Ice Nova to clear out the reflect pack. Sometimes it'll kill a rare. If it doesn't kill the rare with the reflect aura, then I will simply use my main skill to kill it. Next up, coming back, as you can see, Remote Mine, Increased Area of Effect, and Vaal Ice Nova in a 3-link there. I also use Arctic Armor. Level this up as high as you can, but when you're leveling up Arctic Armor, just make sure that its moving mana degen is below your total degen with auras up. So transitioning then into auras, I use Clarity, I use Haste, and I use Discipline. Now this gives me 278 unreserved currently with my current setup, which is enough with my mana regen of 200, and Arctic Armor currently uses 180 while moving, so that's fine. I could get that to like 190 while moving, and we'd still be able to support this just fine. Clarity and Discipline will level up more, and we'll get some more passives in the future that'll help this additionally as well, but it all works perfectly by now. If you guys have seen my EK Mind Over Matter Scion or Shadow, you probably would have already seen how powerful Arctic Armor is, but essentially makes you immune to Void Bearers, immune to Tentacle Miscreations, immune to Fireball creatures. A lot of anything that deals fire or small physical hits is good, and it'll also help you against Physical Reflect with Cascade, because Cascade does deal physical damage. And against Physical Reflect big packs, it can hurt a lot, but because it's a lot of smaller hits of Physical, as long as you're not going too ham with you're also using Critical Weakness, your Arctic Armor will eat up most of the physical damage. As you can see, mine is 120 physical damage taken per each hit, and we deal 150 to 230 physical damage, so it does a big job of mitigating that very effectively. Now, in talking with the theme of Reflect maps again, you can use Purity of Ice in place of Haste if you are doing a Reflect map. And I've mentioned Sephel's Frame in the past as well. Sephel's Frame is a fantastic defensive option for this character if you want to make it a bit more survivable versus Reflect. I currently have 77 cold resist just from the passive tree, and using Purity of Ice boosts that up a fair bit. We can go ahead and cast, where is my Purity of Ice? Just there. We can cast this one as well, and you see it takes us up to 80%, which helps deal with Reflect a lot. And then Sephel's Frame on top of that makes a big boost as well. If you are going into an Elemental Reflect map, what you can actually do is take out Cold Penetration, and you can take out Added Lightning and replace it with Added Chaos. So you will deal a lot less damage. You'll deal pretty consistent damage still, but not as crazy crits, but you'll be very survivable versus Reflect. So that's essentially what I do for Reflect maps, and it works out very nicely. Cast when damage taken, as I mentioned before, is linked to Molten Shell, Keep the level requirements for each of these below 37. Looks like I actually have to level up Molten Shell. Oops! Frost Wall goes to level 7 with a level 37 requirement, and as you've seen, the autocast on that is a very nice defensive mechanic, and Enduring Cry. These Molten Shell, Enduring Cry are always nice to have, but the Frost Wall works fantastically in this build because of the way Glacial Cascade penetrates it. So let's go through gear. The weapon I highly recommend for this build is Divinarius. Divinarius isn't too expensive, it's one you'll have to save up for a little while. It's usually around the 20 chaos mark here in Ambush, but the price may change depending on your league and when you're looking at this and things like that. It has a decent amount of base spell damage, which once you start getting high crit chance and crit multi, increasing your spell damage actually makes a big difference, so it's very nice to have that on there. It also has 140% increased critical strike chance for spells when you calculate in the implicit as well, which makes a very big difference. You can see without power charges, my current crit chance on Glacial Cascade is 45%, and without Divinarius it's all the way down to 30%, so 37%, so it makes a big difference there. And then it has 10% increased radius of area skills, which is what really seals the deal. Like the spell damage and crit is just like a nice wand or a nice dagger. But the radius on area skills really makes a nice difference, and I actually really noticed getting that extra 10%. It made clearing maps and stuff feel a lot better. And don't actually discount the 10 life gained on kill and 5 mana gained on kill. Those are fantastic for sustain. The mana's not a big deal in an Eldritch Battery character, but the life is actually very helpful, and since I don't use Life Leech on this character, because it is a Glass Cannon-y softcore character, it is actually pretty nice for helping you regenerate, basically. When you freeze a pack, and there may be some reflect in there as well, you'll kill the mobs pretty quickly, and you'll regenerate from the life gained on kill per mob, a lot of that reflect damage back, so it's pretty nice for sustain. On your shield, you can just go for a pretty generic crit or spell damage shield like I've done here. I've just got one with 100% crit chance, some life and resist and extra energy shield and stuff like this. You could go for an armor energy shield base type shield. I do recommend trying to get as much armor as you can. It will make you much more survivable. I currently have almost no armor. But otherwise, if you want a more defensive option, you can go for Sephel's Frame. As I've mentioned, that'll help with dealing with reflect a lot, and it's also just a very nice defensive shield in general. Basically, for your gloves, boots, and helmet, I recommend going for armor ES gear where possible. I only have my gloves at the moment, but you make work whatever works. And try and get your nice arrangement. You only need a few green gem slots, so pretty easy to roll one off color on this one. But like rolling one off color is not really too hard, so pretty easy to do. And just go for increased armor ES, life, and resist, basically. Fill out your resists on here as much as possible. You can go for a fizz belt if you like. I don't really recommend it. Getting an extra strength on your belt. This one, unfortunately, is corrupted. I would prefer the strength on it, because it helps with some of the strength requirements of different gems and things like that. But for the most part, just get like a life belt is probably the best choice. And again, just life and resist on the belt. Nothing too fancy to go for there. For your rings and amulets, you need to make sure you get at least some increased mana regeneration. I'm using this amulet pretty much just for that reason. It has mana and mana regeneration on it, which helps a lot with supporting Arctic Armor and the expensive costs of Glacial Cascade, while also giving me enough mana to have all 3 of my auras up at once. So that's very, very important. Try and get that on at least 1 or 2 of your pieces of jewelry. Otherwise, if you can get any crit chance or anything like that, very helpful. I've just gone for pretty much life and resist, and you can see that I've got like some all attributes on here, some strength and all attributes, and that helps with getting additional life and helping support some of your skills and stuff like that. Especially, I think it's a bit necessary to get a little bit of dexterity where you can, so you can see I'm using an Onyx. This has 16 dexterity on it. I have some dexterity on my boots, I think, and that will help a bit, because you actually have to get quite a few dexterity nodes. You need agility, alacrity, and coordination to be able to support a high level Arctic armor, for example. And then for your base chest armor, try and get a 5 link as soon as possible, and eventually aim to get a 6 link. Alternatively, go for a Carcass Jack if you want to go really nice glass cannon, get a lot of extra AoE. Carcass Jack is a fantastic choice if you have the currency to get one and get it 5 or 6 linked, go for that. If you want a more defensive option, or if you want to try and respec this character for hardcore, I recommend going for the Cloak of Defiance, which is the Mind over Matter cloak. If you do go that route, you need to make sure that you have a bit of extra mana space, so you may want to drop haste and use Purity of Ice instead, which will free up a lot of mana. You can see if I drop haste and then if I use Purity of Ice, I go down to about here, and I have about 700 unreserved mana, which is what you should aim for on a Mind over Matter build. So that's pretty easy to get Cloak of Defiance running there, and that's a good defensive option. So finally, let's take a look at the passive tree. Now I rolled Witch because although this goes to the Shadow and Templar start, the Witch gives you the advantage of being able to get this really nice life and mana regen and mana at the start of the Witch tree here. Whereas if you start Templar, you can't. There's nothing useful on the other side of the Templar, and if you roll Shadow, there's nothing useful over here as well. So Witch gets both of those trees there and is much more point efficient. So just going through it, life and mana, this stuff will help a lot with running Eldritch Battery, so make sure to get those. You can additionally grab this 40% from the Templar here as well when you switch to Eldritch Battery, which I did that pretty late game. Go up through Witch here, I grabbed this 25% crit strike chance for spells, because anything over 20% spell crit chance is a very efficient node, so I do grab that. And then I head up through the 4% cast speed nodes here. Cast speed is pretty nice for Glacial Cascade, helps a lot when trying to perma-freeze mobs. And you can see I'm not using faster casting, and my cast speed is actually pretty good, just based on my passives. So it works out pretty nicely. Go through Elemental Dominion into the area of effect radius and blast radius, for obvious reasons, increases the damage and effective cone of Glacial Cascade. Now we do go and grab all of the power charges, so I have power charges including the spell damage per power charge is a very nice boost, power charge over here, and the power charge over by the Shadow as well. So we stretch out and get all of those. For the bandits, I grabbed life, I grabbed a passive point in Cruel, so life in normal, passive point in Cruel, and power charge in Merciless, because you want to get those full 7 power charges. Now, once I picked up Eldritch Battery, I came up and grabbed Deep Thoughts, and that helped a lot with sustaining my mana and getting enough mana to be able to run my auras while still being able to cast my spells. So, the much-mentioned Eldritch Battery, I think, is a core component of this build. I initially had this character set out to be a hybrid build, but hybrid is pretty rubbish, I think, most of the time, unless you can stack a lot of ES. So I thought Eldritch Battery was better. It allows us to run Arctic Armor, which more than makes up for losing that 700 or so ES. Doomcast from that point is only 2 points for 60% crit chance, so that is 30% per passive point, which, as we mentioned, anything over 20% is pretty efficient, so very nice grabbing that there. We come through and grab any dexterity and strength 30 nodes, as you can see there. You probably don't need all the strength nodes if you can get someone gear, but just fiddle around with these based on your gearing. Coming through and grabbing this life. We don't have too much life in this build. It's about 200%, which is fine for a softcore character. And then we come up and grab this Aura Cluster. You can pick up just the reduced mana reservation at the start and towards endgame, so now that I'm in the level 80 plus range, I'll probably pick up Aura Effect and Influence pretty soon. The Bloodthirst and Critical Strike Chance nodes are 2 points per 60, again 30 per point there, so very efficient. We come through, we can grab this life cluster. Later on, I'll despec out of this life cluster here and grab this Purity of Life and life cluster there instead. So obviously going down through Shadow, getting all of these crit strike chance nodes are very nice, and we grab the coordination for extra cast speed and dexterity requirements. You can drop this later if you don't need the dexterity. Coming through Freeze, which gives more chance to freeze, not a big deal, but the cold damage is nice. Mental Acuity is fantastic node, mana regen, int, and critical strike chance, which just gives us a lot more damage in general there. We go through cast speed. I opted for cast speed, 4% per point cast speed is actually very, very good. If you look at something like Nimbleness Cluster, it's 4% per passive, and it's considered a very good cluster, so this is exactly the same thing here, even though it's not a notable. Elemental damage obviously scales pretty well, because we're using lightning and cold on our spell, but we also have a physical factor, so I thought cast speed is probably going to be better overall. And the spell damage nodes are fantastic. Spell damage scales everything, fizz, lightning, and cold, so we grab those for sure. And then coming up through here, we grab Intense Zeal Cluster. As I said, I'll grab Purity of Flesh later. I think in terms of my leveling order, I came up through, got everything pretty much in the Witch area here, grabbed the life, went down into Shadow, and then I stopped probably at Freeze maybe, or Mental Acuity, and after I got the life there, and then I went down and did Templar. You can kind of do this in almost any order you want. There's not too much of a set order for this. So then we come down and grab the Holy Strength Cluster, nice extra life, Elemental Adaptation as soon as you have maxed out resistances, and then the Arcane Potency Cluster is one of the best crit clusters in the game, and Overcharge just in there. From there we can duck down into Templar, grabbing Celestial Walker and the AoE nodes, and Mana Regeneration. Later, we can spend points to grab Intelligence, Life, Discipline and Training, extra life. You can grab a regen if you want. A point of regen certainly wouldn't hurt. And the other thing I would probably opt for is eventually Throat Seeker, because that crit multi is going to give us a lot of extra damage, and you could later go for Nimbleness if you move into the 90s as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed my build guide to my Crit Glacial Cascade, which if you guys have played anything similar or if you play this build and have any feedback, be sure to leave it in the comments below. If you'd like to see this build more in action, I'm going to upload a map commentary playing on this character, so I'll link that on screen now and in the description below, so make sure to check that out if you want to see a bit more how to use the skills and skill rotations and things like that, and how to actually sort of approach strategically playing this character. But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.